begin.
But I have some problem with this bill. And I think it's a bill that targets rural Canadians. And by urban Canadians who don't understand what rural Canadians do or who they are. And this is a tradition that's gone on for as long as I was alive and for centuries before. And this is the very kind of tradition that urban Canadians don't understand when you're talking about regulations to guns.
Bobcat 1-2. Target acquired.
Numéro 2, C-21.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker and honorable senators. I'm going to speak on Bill C-21. Before I start, I want you to know that I have 6 police officers, 1 judge, and 2 lawyers in my extended family. So I kind of agree with the rule of law. And except for stealing chocolate milk when I was a kid from the creamery, I've kept my nose pretty clean. But I have some problem with this bill. And I think it's a bill that targets rural Canadians. And by urban Canadians who don't understand what rural Canadians do or who they are. And so I'll just read it. And you see, my rifles were used for hunting in age ago, and so I no longer hunt. They are my keepsakes from years gone by, but they are in the crosshairs of a new and earnest regulation. It is a regulation that hopes to mitigate crime, but often refuses, in many cases, to direct its focus on those who would commit them. I wanted to believe C-21 meant well, but it is a bill arrogant in assumption concocted by people, many of whom have never owned a weapon or have ever used one, scouted for moose or deer, or set up a moose stand in the rain, or waited on a rut mark until dark. These are extremely important abilities and valuable knowledge for any rural Canadian, white, First Nation, French, or English. And just to get off the speech for a minute, if you're a rural Canadian and live in the Maritimes or anywhere in rural Canada, you probably know that you'd run a river, which means you take a canoe down the river in early spring for fiddleheads. And then you'd go down with your rod and you'd fish trout, and you'd wait for the salmon to come in June. And the grilse would follow the salmon in. And then you'd fish the big trout later on in the summer, and by then you'd be scouting for moose. And you'd set up your moose stand. And later on in November, when it gets cool, you'd be hunting deer. And this is a tradition that's gone on for as long as I was alive and for centuries before. And this is a very kind of tradition that urban Canadians don't understand when you're talking about regulations to guns. So I refuse to say their intentions are malicious, but perhaps they're ill-conceived. So many who will be exploited by this law, those who will be scrutinized, have done nothing to deserve such scrutiny. And I would still say fine if it would stop the great majority of crime and murder, but I'm not convinced it will. It will seem to do so, and that is what this law not only proposes, but desires, that more regulation will seem to do so. It fits the pattern of Canadian oversight that is often both rigid and ineffective. More regulation is the new and treasured opiate of the masses. Why are people writing me about these laws? Why are they so angry about this bill? Because they are being lectured once again by a government that assumes and presupposes a superior moral nature against certain of its own citizenry and acts with uppity condescension to so many who have done no wrong, suspecting them without evidence of things they would not do, while being unable to stop those who will continue to do wrong despite the regulations they continuously and tirelessly propose. This bill targets only those it feels comfortable in targeting.
Hear, hear.
It is a long time since we enjoyed the gratitude of a government for our truckers and common men, the gratitude for ordinary Canadians being extraordinarily generous and decent human beings. It has been a very long time. In fact, we are told we are not allowed to see ourselves as such until we agree to the propositions in many bills before us, to correct who we are, to fulfill a mandate set up by governmental people, very often far more gullible than ourselves, about whom Canadians actually are. This bill is actually cowardly at whom it points the finger at, and blames and will not solve the problem of violence. I wish it did. But this bill will not stop the gangs. The law, in its own blind way, actually proposes to recruit them. This new law solicits others, promotes the idea of a red flag snitching program. We are asking for a community of little snitchers. The net will be cast and cast so wide that among the guilty, too many innocents will be caught in the web. Sooner or later, no one will be immune. All of us will be suspect if we raise the R of the wrong person. This is where the new bill fuses concern and propaganda in order to make gun owners culpable without trial, done in secret by unknown accusers. You would have had to, at one time, belong to the inner circle of a high school glee club to think this was a good idea. The right person's guns may be confiscated, but over time, many innocents will be marked. Yet nothing like this will stop the trade in illegal handguns, the smuggling in and out of certain reserves, the import of weapons through clandestine means by biker gangs and others. And this is where the majority of illegal guns used in crimes are acquired. So will grandfathering a rifle that I bought when I was a boy of 18 because I can carry 8 in the clip stop someone from illicitly purchasing a semi-automatic handgun some desperate night in Scarborough, Ontario? This bill makes thousands guilty by association to a new broad illegality, and our government becomes offended when people decry it. But people have every right to see in its regulatory framework a glaring absurdity that no oversight will correct. Nor do I say there should be no laws regarding this. I am not for one moment saying that. I am saying these clauses are, for the most part, ineffective. I wish they weren't, but they are, that is all. But they do point out how the government feels about Canadians they can assume guilty without trial. There is a bullying trait here, make no mistake. The 2 most violent acts in our country in the last 3 years were done by a venal psychopath obsessed with police cars who did not have much to do with hunting, and another sick and poorly violent man with a bloody knife on a Saskatchewan reserve. Our government has used the horrendous murders in Nova Scotia and in Uvalde, Texas as an asset to support their position. In both cases, the unfortunate missteps of the law order to protect us played their part as well. And Canada is very different than the U.S. An RCMP woman bravely gave her life when she was ambushed because no one gave her the information she needed. She managed to draw her weapon. She managed to fire back. She did the only thing that was left for her to do. I also believe a person has a right to a firearm to protection as much as anyone. If one lives an hour from the nearest RCMP detachment, a gun in the hand is better than a police officer on the phone if someone is intent on harming you or your family. The very human right to self-protection has become vulnerable by laws given to us by people who have security guards and panic buttons. I am not dismissing the violence in Canada. I grew up with it. I knew there has been much violence done by violent men. But so much about this law is sophomoric housekeeping, impotent against rage and hate. I believe that Plato was right. The good do not need laws. The bad will never, ever recognize them. So I will end with this. There was a moment in Uvalde which I saw. I didn't want to see it. I just happened to turn the TV on. A little girl seated at her desk, a child's desk, with her pencil in its pencil groove, with her hands folded neatly and blood on her dress, trying to explain to the man about to shoot her that this was wrong, that she wanted to see her mom, and this was a bad thing to do. But her soul was generous and alive, and his damnable soul was dead. I will never forget her ever seated at her elementary child's desk with the blood of one of her classmates on her dress. The police were in the hall with their guns totally impotent and frozen. I am telling you, I believe there's not a man or a woman I know who I've hunted and fished with who would not have given their life to protect that little girl. And I am sure the same goes for every man and woman in this chamber, those who support this bill or not. And it is true they would have shot him dead because they would have had to do so. They would have had no other choice in the matter. Like that RCMP officer drawing her gun in Nova Scotia, there was no other way. That is the difference between good and evil when it comes to guns, and unfortunately when it comes to, once again, to the misdirection of Bill C-21. And for these reasons, I will be voting against it. Thank you very much.
Senator Martin.
I move the adjournment of the debate.
L'honorable sénatrice.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator Martin, seconded by the Honourable Senator Seidman, that the debate be adjourned until the next sitting of the Senate. Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? Carried.